friend of Caesar. Okay? Makes a little difference here. But Pontius Pilate, the friend of Caesar. Chapter 19, verse 1. While you're turning during these 3 Sundays before the Easter musical presentation, we'll be looking at some characters who were involved very much so in the crucifixion of Jesus. Today, Pontius Pilate, Simon of Cyrene, and Barabbas before we get to Easter. John chapter 19. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and clothed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and were slapping his face. Pilate went outside again and said to them, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging him." Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priest and the temple servants saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" Pilate responded, "Take him and crucify him yourselves, since I find no grounds for charging him." "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, "and according to that law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. He went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus did not give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" "You would have no authority over me at all," Jesus answered him, "if it hadn't been given you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." From that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him, but the Jews shouted, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He sat down on the judge's seat in a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Aramaic, Gabbatha. It was the preparation day for the Passover, and it was about noon. And then he told the Jews, "Here is your king." They shouted, take him away, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Should I crucify your king?" "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest answered. Then he handed him over to be crucified. Then they took Jesus away. Carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him and the 2 others with him, one on either side, with Jesus in the middle. Pilate also had a sign made and put it on the cross. It said, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. So the chief priest of the Jews said to Pilate, "Don't write the King of the Jews, but that he said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" Pilate replied, "What I have written, I have written." Heavenly Father, take us there today. Help us to decide where in this most important event of history we stand. May we all leave here saying today, what a friend we have in Jesus. In his name, amen. Do you have a really great friend? Just, women have lots of friends. Poor old men, we don't have many friends, they say. Poor, pitiful creatures that we are. My best friend and I went to college together and seminary together, and we pastored together, and we traveled together and vacationed together and all those things. But we hadn't seen each other in 2 years, but we're still best friends. Now, women say, "How can that be?" But do you have a friend? a really, really good friend that you would do anything for. Really good friend. Pepper Rogers was a coach of the UCLA Bruins several years ago, the football team, and he was in the midst of a bad run at UCLA. They couldn't win, they couldn't play, they couldn't execute. They didn't have an offense, they didn't have a defense. It was just the most pitiful thing. And then the media turned on him, really. Every article written about him was negative. All the reports about him were negative, and his friends didn't call much anymore. They kind of avoided him, I don't want to be around him. And the alumni were calling for his head, and they said, we've got to get rid of Pepper Rogers. We've got to get a real coach in here. And it just seemed like he didn't have a friend in the world. Well, he went home, he said one day, he said, I don't think I've got a friend in the world, or I don't have many anyway. He said, my dog is my best friend. And he looked at her and he said, everybody needs at least 2 friends, honey. She said, well, buy another dog. Do you have a good friend, a really good friend? One that you defend to the death? Pontius Pilate had a friend so important that to save that friendship, he tried to carry out the greatest miscarriage of justice in the history of the universe, just so he could preserve that friendship. Let me tell you about this man, Pontius Pilate. He was probably from central Italy, as near as the historians can tell us. He was of the equestrian class, which means he was a middle-class guy. He was not nobility, he was not peasant, he was in the middle class, and he became a soldier and rose through the ranks, very disciplined, very tough kind of a guy. And so when the 12th Roman Legion was sent to Syria, they put Pontius Pilate in charge. He was a leader of men, they said. He was an administrator. He was tough as nails. He was a decision maker. The Roman emperor who gave him this opportunity was Tiberius Caesar. He was the adopted son of Augustus Caesar. This man himself was a wicked and lustful and debauched kind of an emperor. He really grew tired of the job. Can you imagine being emperor of the greatest empire in the world, the biggest empire that the world had ever seen, and getting tired of that? He was just tired. I'm sick and tired of this. And so he began to gather friends around him. And his closest friend was a man named Sejanus, who was also one of these middle-class equestrian guys. He said, Sejanus, you and I have known each other since childhood, and I want you to be my top advisor. And it looked almost like the emperor was trying to give his power and all of his authority to Sejanus. So he sort of farmed things out. He was really trying to get everything in place so that he could retire to the Isle of Capri. There he was going to involve himself in some of the most lustful sexual pursuits that a man could find. He said, I'm going to retire to the Isle of Capri, but he maintained the authority, and Sejanus remained in Rome to see about how things would go. Now, Sejanus had a good friend whose name was Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate. They had known each other for a long, long time, and Pontius Pilate had risen in the ranks, and he was a tough kind of a guy. And so when Tiberius and Sejanus were trying to decide who would rule which parts of the empire, Sejanus said, I have this good friend. He's been a great leader of the 12th Legion. His name is Pontius Pilate. And he would make a great leader. He is tough as nails, Emperor. He's just that kind of a tough guy. And so they called Pontius Pilate in and said, we're going to make you the governor of Judea. Now, he'd have liked to have had a better job than that, a little closer to Rome, instead of out in the far-flung edges of the Roman Empire, but he was going to be governor. And Caesar said, you can be governor. And Sejanus was going to be his go-between with the emperor. It was a tough place. he was put in charge. There were 7 million Jews down there. They were on the trade routes from Africa up through the Middle East and on to places further east and even up into the even further west. He was to keep the law and order. They were really close to Parthia, and the Romans always feared that the Parthians were going to invade their territory, because they did from time to time. And so they called Pontius Pilate and said, do you understand what an important job this is? You are to go and represent Rome, the authority of the law of Rome. You are to keep the peace. You're not to allow any uprisings or riots, and you're to keep the tax money coming. You understand, friend? Pontius Pilate understood it very well. He was now procurator, governor. Now, it was customary, when someone reached this level, that he would receive a golden ring from the Roman emperor. And he would receive the title, Friend of Caesar. Amicus Caesarius. Friend of Caesar. Great title. An official title, really. And he got his golden ring with the Amicus Caesarius engraved on it. And so he was sent away to be the governor of Judea. And so he wore his ring proudly. For 10 years, from the year 26 to the year 36, he was head of everything down in Judea. He tried to overlay everything and make Caesar very proud of him. And so at Caesarea, the first thing he did was build a monument and a great altar to Caesar at Caesarea, which was the headquarters of where this man was going. Caesarea was an old city of Palestine, about 23 miles south of Mount Carmel, originally called Stratton, but it was conquered by Pompey in 63 BC, and it was given to Herod the Great by Augustus Caesar. Herod renamed it in honor of Caesar. Of course, he gives me a city, I'm going to name it after him, and so he named it Caesarea. And he had launched a 12-year building project. He wanted a city worthy of his kingdom, and so Herod dedicated it with magnificent games like the Olympics. He built a harbor, he built a theater, he built a great amphitheater, he built a hippodrome where they could have their chariot races, and an aqueduct and a temple, and it was just the most wonderful place you could imagine. And now Pontius Pilate was going there to head up the government in that area. That would be his capital. Well, occasionally, though, he had to leave his beautiful seaside home to go down and see about the rest of the kingdom, about Judea. He didn't really like that. I mean, Jerusalem, that part of the world, that was a dusty, dirty kind of place. And the real problem was he hated Jews. He and his boss, Sejanus, despised Jews. As a matter of fact, most historians say they had it in mind to wipe out all the Jews. So you can see something of their anger and their hatefulness of the Jews. But every now and then he had to leave beautiful Caesarea there on the shores of the blue Mediterranean, and he had to go down to Jerusalem to keep the peace, to hear some cases, to remind the Jews of who was in charge, and just be the governor of this whole area, because, as the ring said, I'm the friend of Caesar. Friend of Caesar. Well, Pilate got off to a bad start, though, with the Jews. On his first visit to Jerusalem, he had his soldiers marching in, very big military parade, and they marched through the streets of Jerusalem with their standards held high. And on top of those standards, there was a carved image of Caesar, and it said, Divine Caesar. Now, the Jews pitched a fit because, there is a commandment that says you shall make no graven images of any other god and have them in my presence. The divine Caesar, though, Pilate said, is my friend. And the Jews exploded in anger. Now, previous governors sort of let things go. They said, we're here to keep the peace. We don't want riots. We don't want trouble. And these people are very troublesome. We don't want all the trouble they could give us. And so they pretty much let the Jews have it their way, but not Pontius Pilate. He hated the Jews. So he marched his soldiers in there, and it caused riots, days of riots. And finally, Pilate said, I've got to go. I've got to get back to Caesarea. And so he headed back in his chariot, the 90 miles, back up to Caesarea, and thought it was all over with, but those Jews followed him. Got into Caesarea, started rioting. Every 5 days of riots, marches, demonstrations. Pontius Pilate was sick to death of these Jews. He said, I'm going to teach them a lesson. He said, meet me at the amphitheater, the big Colosseum thing there they had in Caesarea. Meet me there, and we're going to talk about this. We're going to settle this once and for all. And so those Jews met there. And then Pontius Pilate came, marching his soldiers, 3,000 soldiers armed with their swords, and they circled those Jews. And then Pilate said, take your swords. They held their swords up. Pilate looked at those Jews and said, if you don't shut up, get out of my face, leave this alone, I'm going to cut every one of you's head off. You're going to put up with it. You're going to have the image of Caesar in Jerusalem and everywhere else, or I will kill every one of you. Well, you know what they did? They pulled off their head scarves, put their necks out, and said, go ahead. Go right ahead. Well, he couldn't do this to hundreds of demonstrators. You can't lop that many heads off and expect Caesar not to hear about it and say, what is wrong with you? So he had to swallow his pride, and he withdrew his standards. But it was reported to his friend, who was Caesar. Well, a little bit later on, when Pilate was back in Jerusalem, he said, this place has a pitiful water supply. We need to build an aqueduct, but we don't have money. Where would we get the money to build an aqueduct? I said, well, we don't have enough tax money to do it. But one of his advisors said, you know what, that temple, the people are always bringing money to that temple. You could go to that temple and probably get everything you needed. And so Pontius Pilate went to the temple of God, marched himself in there, and took the money that he needed for the aqueduct. Well, more rioting and more killings. He killed many of the people this time. And he got another bad report sent to Caesar. He was really on report now. Well, one day he and his wife were back in Jerusalem, and they decided to redecorate the palace. I mean, this palace has not been redecorated in years, and so one of the things he thought would really make it shine and look great was to put his ceremonial shields up, kind of like with the stained glass. Hang these ceremonial shields in the holy city, and on them it said these words, Caesar is divine. In other words, Caesar is our God. Well, we had another riot. Historian Philo said it was to heap insults on the Jews and to cause trouble for the Jews. The Jews sent a letter to Emperor Tiberius Caesar. Pilate sent his own letter to Caesar. And Tiberius looked at it all and just about lost his mind. He sent the most scathing letter back to Pilate. You knucklehead, take down those shields. What are you trying to do? You do nothing but cause trouble down there. Do you want me to relieve you of your duties? Get with it and quit causing trouble. Pilate had to look at his ring, make sure he was still the friend of Caesar. He didn't want to do anything that would cause them to tear his hand off, as they did sometimes when someone was accused of not being the friend of Caesar, but had one of those rings, and they would rip their fingers right off. Stop causing trouble. You remember in Luke chapter 13, Jesus was talking about sometimes bad things happen, and we just have no explanation of what in the world has happened. And he said, why did Pilate kill those Galileans and mix their blood up with all that animal blood in the temple? Because, once again, he hated the Jews. He wanted to teach them a lesson. And so a bunch of Galileans came down to Jerusalem and offered their sacrifices. And as they offered the lambs, Pilate's soldiers came in there and hacked them to death. So there was blood all over the floor, animal blood, human blood. It was something else, and it caused a great report, bad report sent to Tiberius Caesar. Pilate and the people he governed, hated each other. He did all he could to annoy them for 6 or 7 years. He really wanted to destroy the Jews. That's never worked out yet, has it? Pilate was on report. Caesar was watching. Pilate still had his ring, though, his golden ring, amicus Caesaris. Maybe I'll get a promotion, get out of this stinking place one of these days. And then steps came that got him out of that place. Pilate was the governor during Jesus' ministry. He started about 26. He finishes up about 36. If you remember, the Sanhedrin was trying to get rid of Jesus. He became their enemy. He embarrassed them in the temple. He said, "You're a bunch of phonies. You've turned my house into a den of thieves." And so much more, Jesus said, that made the Sanhedrin, the rulers of the Jews, so very, very mad, and they wanted to get rid of him. And so Caiaphas was the high priest, and he was the man who came up with a plan to get rid of Jesus, and he just needed someone to help him out. And Judas Iscariot, for 30 pieces of silver, said, "I'll help you out." And so they came up with a plan. They wanted Jesus dead and out of their business, but he was too popular. To kill Jesus, to stone Jesus for the reasons that they came up with, that said he's a blasphemer because people say he's the Son of God. He's the Christ, the Son of the living God. They accused him of blasphemy and said, "We ought to stone you to death." But they knew if they did, there would be riots because so many people loved Jesus. So they said, "We've got to get rid of him, but I don't know how we're going to do it." "I know, we'll get the Romans to do it. We can get the Romans to help us." The Romans are the ones who can pass a death sentence anyway. We can't even pass a death sentence anymore. So back in John 18, verse 28 and following, they brought Jesus to Pontius Pilate in the early, early morning. He said, "What are you people doing here? What do you want?" They shoved Jesus out in the way, and he'd been slapped around and beaten up all night already. "Do you have some charges against this man?" "Well, of course we have charges against this man," they reply in John 18. "Now, you think we'd bring him here and hand him over to you if he's not a criminal?" In other words, don't ask questions, just crucify the man. That's the way you Romans put people to death. You don't stone them, you put them to death on a cross. Pilate could have easily said, "Okay, I'll look the other way." But Pilate hated the Jews too. He didn't want to make them happy. Even though it involved killing another Jew, he said, "I'm not going to give you people anything you want." So he brings Jesus in and examines Jesus. "You've been accused of perverting the nation, of urging people not to pay taxes, of calling yourself a king. Is all this true?" And they worked through, and they couldn't find any witnesses, of course, who agreed on anything. And Pilate said, "I don't think any of this holds up, and I don't want to make those Jews happy." But the thing about being a king did get his attention, because you could not declare yourself a king, and the people could not declare yourself a king. Only the Romans could appoint kings. So the king thing it was high treason to be a king. It was death sentence. "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "Well, who told you that? Is that your opinion? Or you've looked around? Surely you know about me." Angry. That's what it was. "I'm not a Jew. I don't care anything about your Jewish laws. Why do your own people hate you?" Jesus talked about the kingdom, but it was not of this world. And so Pilate said, "There's no reason to kill this man. I'm already on report. If I let an innocent man go to death, that's not going to look well." Pilate said, "So you are a king, huh?" And Jesus said, "Yes, that's why I was born and have come to this world to testify to the truth." With a sneer on his face, Pilate said, "Truth? What is truth?" You see, for Pilate, people like Pilate and people a lot today, truth is whatever works in your life. They say there's no absolute truth. Too bad, Pilate. Truth is standing in front of your very nose, and you don't even recognize truth. How do you govern truth? Whatever you want to call it. Truth. My truth, your truth, somebody else's truth, but no absolute truth. Whatever works, that's the truth. Is that right? No, it's not right. Jesus is the truth. Weren't you glad to hear Franklin Graham this week in Billy Graham's sermon as he got down to the point? And he said, now, you know, Dad's gone to heaven. And there's only one way. Now, people are going to tell you there are other ways. Now, he said this on that funeral, millions of people watching. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And Franklin Graham said, and Jesus meant that. Here's truth standing in front of Pontius Pilate. You wonder if truth is just relative, what's he going to do? People have all kind of crazy ideas about making up their own truth. Remember back when Willie Nelson was doing so well, and before he met the IRS, before income tax day came, and he had millions of dollars, and Willie even built his own golf course. And he brought some people out one day to look at his golf course, and they said, wow, beautiful place. Someone said, what's par here? Willie said, well, see that hole over there? That's a par 47. Yesterday I birdied it. Truth. Make up your own truth. Make up your own truth. Alan Bloom wrote that book, The Closing of the American Mind. He said it's terrible as a college professor. When you look there in the fall of the year and all these young smiling faces of the incoming freshman class, and you know that these young people really only believe in two things. One is they believe that all truth is merely a matter of opinion, whatever works. And two, they believe that all morality is merely a preference. There is no truth anymore, is there? Except Jesus, there never has been. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I've come to bear witness to the truth. Pontius Pilate says, truth, what is truth? Jesus is truth. Jesus is the truth. Too bad Pilate didn't recognize the truth standing right in front of him. He looked at the charges of Jesus. He still found no problems. As you saw this morning, he washed his hands and said, I wash my hands of this. You can't wash your hands when it comes to Jesus and say, I don't want to be for him. I'm not against him. I just wash my hands of him. You can't do that. That doesn't work. You're either for him or against him. Pontius Pilate wanted to let Jesus go to the very end, but he saw that a riot was coming about. And so he said, I don't want a riot. That's another write-up, a charge that will go straight to Caesar if I have a riot here. And so somebody says, hey, you know who's in town? Herod. One of the Herod boys is here. He rules up in Galilee. Jesus is from Galilee. Send this Jesus up to Galilee. Send him over to the Galilean leader. Well, Herod wanted to see Jesus. He wanted to meet Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus do a little magic. Jesus wouldn't even talk to him. And so he sent him back to Pilate, and he said, well, if we were in Galilee, I would handle this thing, but we're in Jerusalem. It's your ball game. So they send him back with a message from Herod. Pilate's probably eating breakfast by this time. His wife's been talking about a terrible dream she's had during the night. Don't have anything to do with this Jesus of Nazareth. Pilate's been thinking, no, here they come. Oh, no. Sounds like trouble either way. Jesus is popular and people will get upset and maybe riot if I have him crucified, but I know these Jews are demanding blood. I know. The holiday pardon. Why didn't I think of that at first? The holiday pardon. Every Passover we have a holiday pardon where it's customary for the Roman governor to bring two criminals out and say, I'm going to let one of them go free today. You choose. And so the crowd would choose which one to let go. But he didn't want them to kill Jesus. He just had this uneasy feeling. His wife told him, you better not have anything to do with him. And so Pilate said, go down to the jail, bring out the nastiest, dirtiest, filthiest, sorriest human being who ever lived, the one that everybody's afraid of, and bring him up here and let's stand him beside Jesus and see what these people do then. There's no way they'll let him go. They'll let Jesus go. And so they found a man who was a murderer, an insurrectionist, and a robber, who would just as soon kill you as to look at you, and stood him next to Jesus and said, which one should I let go for you? Surely you want to let Jesus. No, they didn't. They said, give us Barabbas and crucify Jesus. Pilate couldn't believe it. Why, he says, why? Study all four of the Gospels. Why? This man is innocent. What do you want to do this to him for? I'm going to have to let him go free. I just can't do that. And then it happened. Pilate heard a voice from the crowd. And the voice from the crowd said, if you release this Jesus, you are not the friend of Caesar. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. He must have looked at his golden ring and saw the words Amicus Caesaris. I'm a friend of Caesar. I'm a friend of Caesar. I don't want to lose this. If you let Jesus go, the one who calls himself king, the one that people call king, then you are no longer a friend of Caesar, and we will make sure he knows it. Now, Pilate knows what's going to happen. He would be arrested, his finger would be torn, and the ring would be confiscated. And he would probably be put to death. And so what's he going to do? He's got to make a decision, hasn't he? He's got to do something. And so he signs the death warrant and says, crucify him then. And the execution squad was summoned. And Pilate made a sign, and the sign said, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. And he hung it on there. He wouldn't change it, even though that was an embarrassing sign to the Jews. So Jesus died on the cross for your sins and for my sins. And when Pilate heard that Jesus was dead, he probably looked at his golden ring, and he must have said, I'm still the friend of Caesar. I saved my ring. Now, Jesus had to die for him to keep that ring. Pilate was a friend of Caesar, but Pilate was not a friend of Jesus. He was on the wrong side of God, wasn't he? Just 3 years later, Tiberius Caesar has had enough. There's been another riot in Samaria. He summons Pilate to come to Rome for a reckoning. I've had enough of you. On his way there, Tiberius Caesar died, though, and when Pilate got there, Tiberius was dead, and they exiled him to Gaul, they say, where he committed suicide. But he wanted to be the friend of Caesar, but he lost his golden ring. What will you not give up for Jesus? Have you been thinking during this message? What is it that you hold so closely to that you would not dare give up even for Jesus? Are you the friend of Caesar? Like Pontius Pilate? Most of us have something we've got, or we wouldn't be holding back, would we? Maybe it's our pride or our arrogance or some pet sin or some popularity or some friend somewhere. Are you the friend of Caesar or the friend of Jesus? You ever heard of Joseph Scriven? Joseph Scriven was a sinner. He heard the gospel. He read his Bible. He came to understand that he was a sinner and that the wages of sin is death. And he was condemned to death, he felt like. He was lost in sin. He was hopeless. He was helpless before God. and knew that when he stood before his Maker one day to be judged, to give an account of himself, no friend would ever speak up for him. But when he read the gospel, and he read about the cross and the death of Jesus Christ, and when he read in Matthew 11:19 and Luke 7:34, where Jesus was called the friend of sinners, Joseph Scriven repented, called upon the Lord. And as he thought this over, as he worked out the details, as he grew in the Lord, he wrote a little hymn one day. Want to guess what it's called? Choir, you know this, don't you? Huh? Come on. What a friend we have in Jesus. What a friend we have in Jesus. Not in Caesar, but in Jesus. Do you have that friend who will stand for you one day? Jesus. Or